College Football Nerds here talking Alabama and Wisconsin. Another one of these pretty good premier out-of-conference games. Alabama has been accused of never going on the road. They were the kings of the neutral site games, and this time they are headed up to Camp Randall, a tough place to play. Me and Josh are going to get nerdy with y'all and talk about it. Might have a little bit of an Alabama lean, just to let y'all know kind of where we're headed, given that Wisconsin ain't played nobody, Paul. All right, so homework for y'all. 1, give us your score prediction in the comments. 2, please like, please subscribe. That's 3 things, but you're going to do all 3. All right, Josh, this game Saturday for Alabama, we'll start with them with South Florida. This is 2 years in a row that South Florida's given them everything they wanted for 3.5 quarters. The thing that I want you to talk about, I'm going to get into the defense a little bit later, is really, I have a question for you in that we saw the difference once Pritchett came in for Formby at the offensive line, and some of that may have just been South Florida wearing down, and it was just time, and the dam broke. But how much do you just kind of throw this game out because so much of Alabama's offense relies on that offensive line working, and they had so many pieces out and moved around, versus I saw some stuff in there that really concerned me if I'm an Alabama fan?
Everything like that has to be taken sort of all into consideration, and it's always a little bit of both, right? I don't think Alabama is the team that was struggling as horribly were in the second quarter when you project them out the rest of the year. If they've got both starting offensive tackles and they're both healthy, I think this Alabama team looks very different. And I always make the point when you're dealing with offensive line and defensive back injuries and wide receiver injuries, all 3, if you lose your number one guy, your number one wide receiver, your top cover corner, your left tackle, it tends to have cascading effects, because the problem is it's not just that Alabama's left tackle's out. Well, 1, Alabama's left tackle was out. 2, their backup left tackle was out. So they slid their All-American left guard to left tackle, played a transfer reserve at left guard, played a guy that was competing for right tackle the whole time at right tackle that struggled. And now you've got 2 new starters and a guy that's horribly out of position. So where you should have an All-American, you've got a backup. The All-American is now struggling at left tackle, doing an okay job, but that's not what he's used to playing and he's not built for. And you got a right tackle that's struggling. And it's just everything goes to crap. In the same way, if you lose your star corner, you may have to move a safety to corner, and you move your nickel to maybe your failed or your boundary corner. And now the nickel that was really good can't actually cover guys down the field. The safety's not fast enough to play nickel, and your new backup safety you have in is not very good. And now everybody's terrible. This is just something that happens sometimes. And so I don't think that is who Alabama is. But there were a lot of the same problems that we've seen previously, right? Like we've talked about, Alabama has issues at the offensive line in identifying blitzes. Todd Orlando's scheme at South Florida is notorious for being extremely aggressive with a lot of exotic blitz packages. And I think something, this is a thing that, Daniel, I really wanted to talk about, so I'm going to just go ahead and get this out in this video right now. Something we're seeing across the landscape of college football, I think, is that defenses are catching up to offenses. And in particular, these defensive schemes are getting much more aggressive, and they're getting much more blitz heavy. And what that's doing is it's meaning either the offense doesn't work, like you get stuffed, you get penetration, or you get explosive plays. And we've seen this now from Alabama 2 games in a row, where they're either doing nothing or they are scoring in 2 plays. 60, 80-yard runs, touchdown passes, etc. And so it's really hard for me to decouple what is that Alabama offense we saw last year and what is this problem. But what I can tell you is Alabama struggles too much with that style of defense. They struggle too much when teams bring 6 or 7. And that's what South Florida was doing in that game. They were bringing 6 or 7 blitzers. They were running cover 1 or cover 0 on the back end, saying we're just going to play man coverage tight to the receivers, whoever's on the field. We're going to give you the one-on-one deep if you can hit it, but we don't think you're going to have time, and we don't think you're going to pick us up in pass pro. And Alabama doesn't have an answer. It means you got a lot of one-on-one blocks. Somebody misses a block, there's pressure. And the big thing I see with Milroe is once he starts getting interior pressure, meaning once the offensive line starts to struggle or not doing their job in the inside, he starts to bail. He starts to backpedal at the snap, he frequently gets 10 to 15 yards deep by the time that he's really trying to get ready to throw. The problem is when you do that as an offensive lineman, it's a pocket, right? It's a circle. That circle needs to go about 8 yards deep generally. When you get past 8 yards, if you got an offensive tackle and I'm trying to redirect a guy, he can circle around me and get to 12 yards. I almost cannot block a speed rush that deep. And so now your right tackle, Formby, who's not super duper athletic, just starts getting whipped because Milroe's too deep. Now, because Milroe's getting too much pressure, it starts getting in his head. He's starting to roll out of the pocket. And they're no longer, this is kind of, I think, classic Alabama problem for the last year and a half. They're not trying to get the ball out quickly because they're getting blitzed. They're trying to hold up so they can hit the bomb to score immediately. And that's not sustainable. That's not consistent. Maybe you'll block them. Maybe you'll get that big pass. But one, those passes are hard to hit and complete. Two, it's hard to have that much time. And I think all of this was sort of, in theory, negated by scheme because they have worked in more receiver screens. They did receiver screens and running back screens and these things to try to get their offense to work early on. But then the problem is if you get a holding call, if you have a false start, those plays aren't going to get you enough yardage to get you out of a 1st and 20. So you have to throw them out of the playbook. And with the interior offensive line being disrupted, they weren't running the ball for crap. So if you're in 2nd and 6 and somebody blitzes you, you can throw that. You just go ahead and say they're going to blitz a ton. We're going to throw a receiver screen. If you get 4 yards, it's 3rd and 2. We're on schedule. Well, if you get 1 yard, now it's 2nd and 9. You throw a wide receiver screen. It's 3rd and 6, and now you're 3rd and long, and you blitz, and it all falls apart. So it's a long explanation, Daniel, and I don't know if you want to add to it, but I think this is a repetition of what we saw last year, and I think it's a bit of a one-off because of how the offensive line was built, that they would struggle with a South Florida. But these concerns absolutely are concerns that are going to show up if you're in a playoff scenario against a defensive line that can get real pressure with that kind of a defense.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because on the other side of the fence, you've got Wisconsin, who's had their own offensive struggles. Defenses look pretty good, and that's what you've come to expect. But when you've got a returning really good running back, Malusi, and then you get a transfer in Van Dyke, and there's a whole discussion, I think, about that kind of dovetails into your discussion or observations about how the defenses have caught up with the offenses. There is a dearth of quality transfers over the last 2 years, especially this year, in college football at the quarterback position. Van Dyke was a guy that came in that had some success in the past. He was really streaky, but had some success and didn't get it done or hasn't been getting it done so far at Wisconsin. He's been kind of the guy that we've seen in the Mertz, Peyton Thorne, where it's not an efficient quarterback, not high completion percentage. Yards per attempt is in that 6 to 7 range, which isn't great. Wisconsin, to me, failure to hit 400 yards in back-to-back weeks when you play South Dakota and Western Michigan, that's tough because that's efficiency issues that we see at a Notre Dame and a Michigan, very similar in that, and I said this Saturday night about Alabama's offense is they're needing all 3 downs to get a first down. Everything is hard. Everything is like really painful, and there's no getting into any kind of schedule offensively. The difference is Alabama has proven in both weeks they've had that problem a little bit, but they've proven that they can also supplement the defenses catching up to their offense with just out-athleting people and beating people over the top. And so even though that you're not really getting momentum offensively in terms of consistently putting drives together, you are able to at some point hit those deep shots. With Wisconsin, it doesn't feel that way to me. It feels like an offense that has those painful moments or maybe painful halves or quarters, but they don't supplement it with enough big plays to get into those 30s and 40s against the bad teams, which concerns me given what I've seen from this Alabama defense so far, which we thought might be a weakness, but it looks like, I don't think South Florida's a great offense. I don't think that Western Kentucky is a great offense, but what we've seen from Alabama looks better than what we've seen the last couple of years from them, which to me might spell trouble for Wisconsin offensively.
Yeah, I mean, you can talk about Alabama's scare with South Florida, which I think probably was something of a unique set of circumstances, and we talked about that last year, right? The whole thing with Milroe being the backup quarterback for them, and backup at the time, right, being benched and not playing that South Florida game was, in my opinion, actually a bit overblown. I think the offensive line issues were a bigger problem. Booker, the guy that got moved out, didn't play in that game. Blah blah blah. Unique situation. Wisconsin, this may be who they are, and I think that's much more concerning. When you looked at that game, going back and rewatching those first two games, one, I think the concerns of the interior defensive line that Wisconsin had going into the season and then suffering an injury there are only worse than was maybe imagined. And then from a passing perspective, Van Dyke looks like very much the same guy he was at Miami. 7.9 yards per attempt is not terrible, but against a team like South Dakota, you would expect a lot better. Those FCS teams, if you watch the South Dakota State game, if you watch against Oklahoma State, if you watch North Dakota State against Colorado, the big thing that they struggle with when they go up in competition against FBS is defense. They do not have the level of defender athlete that FBS teams do, and defense is about experience and it's about talent, and it's very much 1A, 1B, what matters more. There's usually not a guy on that defense for an FCS team that could have gotten a scholarship on the FBS team, frankly. Sometimes they have some guys that are sort of flyer NFL draft pick types, but it's a one-off. By and large, the majority of the defense is literally a scout team for a Power 5 team. And so Wisconsin did not do more than they did is a concern. I mean, they got outrushed per carry, 4.4 yards per carry to 4.2 by South Dakota in that game. They had 171 yards rushing. They did it on 41 carries. And the big problem, I think, is that Van Dyke's ability to pass down the field is still very suspect. He's not a phenomenal decision maker when it comes to his reads, and he misses too many opportunities, and his mechanics are just too inconsistent. He's pretty mobile. He's kind of a scrappy guy. Daniel, I'll tell you, he reminds me a lot of Max Johnson, of what we've seen from him from years, and I hate that Max Johnson got injured against North Carolina. Glad to hear that he thinks he'll be able to be healthy enough maybe to play at the end of the season. But to me, he's a very similar player in that he can kind of scrappily put some plays together. But if you want to get stuff rolling and you want to get stuff clicking, it's like he doesn't have it in him to mechanically be consistent enough to drive that offense down the field. And from just a pure passer perspective, he's not consistent or good enough to sustain a deep passing game. And when you have those problems, you start ending up in a situation where defenses are able to key on you. And you get the reality where Wisconsin's at right now, where they don't run the ball well enough to sustain drives, or even sometimes to stay on schedule, and they don't pass well enough to be explosive. So you score 20 to 30 points on what has been highly inferior teams. To your point, Alabama they're not just better than the two teams Wisconsin's played; they are orders of magnitude better, I think, than who Wisconsin's played. Because it's not just South Dakota as an FCS. I watched Western Michigan against Ohio State, and I got to be honest, I thought Western Michigan maybe looked worse than Akron in week one. They are not a good football team. And a little bit of it's probably playing those two teams back to back, but I'm concerned. I'm really concerned whether Wisconsin is going to be able to move the ball at all on Alabama. And this is, again, our channel is very honest, and if you're a Wisconsin fan, please like, subscribe, watch our videos. I promise when you're having a better season, and I think under Fickle, you will, that will be more positive. But right now, I don't know that Wisconsin is as good offensively as South Florida is. Just being blunt. Brown is a bad passer at South Florida, but if the guy could throw, he'd be Cam Ward. Because as an athlete, he's phenomenal, and the run game is good. I don't know that Wisconsin's there. And so I just struggle to see this being a game where Wisconsin's going to score more than 13, 14, 17 points, absent something really fluky happening.
Yeah, and that's where you've got to – if you're going to beat Bama's defense this year, it's going to be testing those corners. We saw South Florida had some receivers get open, I think 3 or 4 times that they could have hit some deep shots if their quarterback could hit the broadside of the barn, and he could not. But what's interesting to me is, okay, Wisconsin's played Western Michigan, they played South Dakota. Josh, do you know how many? Guess how many passes they've completed over 22 yards
It's probably
in
about
two
two or
games?
three, right? Yeah.
Two, and they were both in this last game. Their long completion against
Well,
Western
they didn't
Michigan was
have
17
against
yards.
the opener Western Michigan. I don't think they had any play over that. Did they? I don't know that they had any play over 20 yards in that entire
Yeah,
game.
yeah, and then in South Dakota they had a C.J. Williams caught the 50-yarder, got a touchdown, and then there's another 30-yarder. Everything else was 21, 22, and then 7, 7, 8, 2. So you don't have wide receivers in an explosive passing game. Like you've got a quarterback with a good arm, but you don't have an explosive passing game that can really exploit where Alabama is kind of weak, and that's those corners. You're not going to – I don't think you're going to run on them. I don't think that, middle of the field, I don't think is really open for you. They've got good safety play. It's really going to boil down to, if Wisconsin wants to be in this game, and they can, is if the defense is good enough to put that same type of pressure on Milroe. I will say this, with what I think is a less talented offensive staff last year, they figured out pretty quickly how to get Milroe out of these problems. And I do think the offensive line was a bit of just a weird situation. That being said, I don't know that. I mean, I do think there's still some kind of ghosts in that machine for Alabama that they're going to have to sort out. But the thing is, they can go 3 and out, and then touchdown, touchdown, touchdown. Like that's very, very possible. The boom or bust thing is real for Alabama's offense. But it's not just bust. Like they have so many athletes all over the field that you're going to give up some big shots. Okay, so talk a little bit about, Camp Randall's a great venue. It's a tough place to play. Talk a little bit about sort of, given that Milroe has shown that he can get rattled. And this is really, I'm trying to think of like he hasn't played in that many big away games. What's the potential to just have that be I don't know, 10 to 12 point swing in terms of advantage for them?
I think noise is a factor as much as anything because it disrupts the offensive line. In terms of what Alabama wants to be able to do to succeed in this game, it's going to be predicated on the run. The interior are kind of right up the middle for Wisconsin is the weakness. I think Wisconsin fans are aware of that. But I will say that Wisconsin does have some good edge players. I mean, Hills has been a good player for them. Wooler at safety is one of, if not, top 5 safety in college football right now. If they can get noise to get a little bit of pressure on Alabama, I think Milroe, sometimes in those situations on the road, if pressure's coming, he starts to kind of get in his own head a little bit. And he will make mistakes. He will throw interceptions. He will kind of, I won't say panic, but it's really what happens is it gets tunnel vision, frankly. He doesn't see it coming. He gets blindsided. He has a high propensity to fumble the football when he's hit, I've noticed. And he also can, he can throw the ball up for grabs. And that could be enough to be, a 2-score swing in Nebraska's favor. Even if it doesn't put points on the board in Nebraska, maybe it takes them off. Last year at home, Alabama was a 10.2 yard per attempt team, but on the road they were 8.8. Not a huge difference, but a difference. And if you go through the games, that's a little bit deceptive because they had a couple games where they really didn't play high level competition, home and away. But in the games that really mattered, right? It did. Just going through the game log, right? Like at Auburn. He threw well, but it wasn't really to the end of the game that he got anything going. In 2023 at Texas A&M, he was, again, hit some bombs, but he was very inconsistent. It seems like this offense as a whole for Alabama, it's either on or off, and it goes back to the earlier discussion we have that teams on the road ramp up the pressure, and either it hits home or it really doesn't. And so the question for Wisconsin, I think, is if you can get pressure. And if you can get pressure, I think Alabama's offense can kind of go to a shell. And this can end up being a low-scoring game. If you can't get pressure, Alabama's receiving core, skill players, their running game, everything is absolutely as good as anyone in college football. Their skill player talent is right up there with Ohio State's. I would say I'm going to be honest with the injuries at Texas. Ohio State and Alabama have the best set of skill position players in the country. I don't think Texas's are as good. I do not think Georgia's are as good. They don't have the combination of running backs and receivers that those two teams have. Alabama is the one team that can probably match Ohio State in that regard. Just talking wide receivers and running backs. And the whole question is whether you give Alabama the chance to really get those guys the ball in space or not. Because if you do, they are going to beat you, and they're going to beat you pretty badly.
So, piggybacking on this, before we get into scores, I want to comment on one thing that I absolutely hate, and that's big noon kickoff, big noon Saturday, biggest game in the Big Ten at 11 Central, which is Alabama time, 12 if you're on the East Coast. It's crazy to me that people on the West Coast, this is going to really be an issue when some of these West Coast teams that are around the Big Ten are playing big noon Saturday. Their fans are going to be, how crazy are you going to be at 9 a.m.? I don't know. But that to me is ridiculous because it neutralizes what should be, like, if you're in the Big Ten, the biggest games you play are at 11 a.m. or lunchtime. Like, your fans are not as loud. It's not as hostile of an environment as it would be if the game was at 6, 7 o'clock at night. And that's most of the SEC big games are at either 2:30, which means by the end of it, you're pretty lathered up, especially if you're one of those stadiums that sells alcohol. You know, you get some portion of night, or it's a 6:30 game, 6 o'clock kickoff, something like that, and you got a whole full night game. You never get that in the Big Ten. And I think some of it's probably because those November games are pretty cold at night, but, like, that kind of sucks to me. Like, I would hate as a fan to know that I don't have the biggest advantage I have is my home field, and it's not as rowdy as it could be. And I know it's still going to be rowdy, and I know they're going to get up for Alabama, but that's just a thing that sticks in my head. And I think it's going to be really acute when, you know, I don't know if they're going to adjust it for the West Coast teams, but if you've got Oregon and their big game against Ohio State or whatever, and it's 9 a.m. kickoff local time, it's kind of ridiculous. But anyway, Josh, give me a score on this one, and then I'll give you mine.
My score in this one, you know, the spread, I looked it up, it's 15.5, right? It's hard to pick because I don't know what version of Alabama is going to show up, but I'm going to go on a limb and say, based on how that South Florida game ended, that they're going to prioritize getting a healthier offensive line together. I'm going to say 42-10. And I don't think it's going to be a game that Alabama just jumps out to a huge lead. I could be wrong on it. But I don't think – look, I don't think Wisconsin's going to be able to move the ball. And if you can't move the ball, you give the other team a lot of possessions. That was the flip side of that South Florida game that I think – you know, that, and people, if you watched us long enough, you probably picked up on this. I think in terms of possessions, not necessarily plays, South Florida had 17 possessions. Alabama had 16. The fact that they scored as low as they did through the game was crazy because they played essentially a full game, which is about 12 possessions midway through the third quarter when it was a 14-13 game. Wisconsin's probably going to give Alabama the ball a lot because they're not going to sustain drives. And if Alabama can run in the interior, which I think they're probably going to be able to do against Wisconsin and their defensive scheme and just really given the lack of depth on the defensive line based on what I've seen from the last two games from Wisconsin, they're never going to be able to get Alabama off schedule. And Alabama's going to slowly go down and score, and they're going to slowly go down and score. Maybe Wisconsin get some points on the board because Van Dyke is capable of putting a drive or two together, but they're not going to be able to do it consistently. And it's going to snowball until they get out of their element. And if Wisconsin is in a position where they have to throw to win, I just don't think they have the pieces to do that and not create negative plays and not create a blowout snowball situation. It is what it is. I just don't think – I think if they had been healthier at defensive line and at interior defensive line especially, this might have been a pretty different ball game. But the current situation for Nebraska, with as thin as they are, it's just not good. I don't think they're going to hold up. Wisconsin, sorry. It's both red team. I keep looking at my notes and have a big red team, and every Wisconsin fan right now, you hate me. It's fine. Nebraska's playing good football. Don't be insulted.
I am in this wait and see approach with Alabama. I think that they've got all of these pieces, but something just doesn't feel right yet. I still think they're working out some of the wrinkles of knowing what to call with the offensive personnel they have. They don't have that feel. The staff doesn't have that feel yet. And I saw a lot of struggles for Alabama to run interior at all this week. I mean, they were getting stoned at the line. And look, I know they had some pieces out or whatever, but I have a hard time believing that South Florida is going to, like, South Florida went 7-6 last year. How many teams had better lines than Alabama's third team? I don't know. I don't know. And it's on the road. To the previous point about road games for Alabama, they had a 6-point win against Texas A&M last year. It was a weird game. They did not play well offensively against Auburn. And those are the only 2 road games of note. I mean, Kentucky sucked last year. They were mediocre. Struggled at South Florida on the road. That was a rainy game. Jalen Milroe didn't play. All that. Mississippi State sucked. They only had 2 road games last year, Auburn and Texas A&M. And that Auburn game they should have lost. They played poorly offensively. I will say for the South Florida game, you talk about fumbles being random. They lost all 3 of their fumbles. South Florida got the 1 fumble that they had back. So that's another thing that's like not repeatable. I think Alabama wins but doesn't cover. Give me 27-13. This offense should be able to put 40 points up on South Florida with some backups at offensive line. I haven't seen from Jalen Milroe the ability to consistently put drives together enough for me to think that they can just go up and put it on anybody. But if they do that 42-10, that to me is going to mean that you just memory hole South Florida game, right, Josh? Like if they do what you think they're going to do, especially if they can do it running the ball at like 6.5 yards a clip, does that mean for you that like you just don't even count the South Florida game? Sort of how we felt about the South Florida game halfway through the season last year?
Yes, but maybe even to a bigger extent. I mean, we talk about there's really 2 excusable situations in college football. The first is if you have a quarterback injury week of or during the game. No team responds well in those situations. Sometimes you have a backup that comes in and is phenomenal, but sometimes the guy comes in and he's terrible. It's just never a reflection of who a team is. And the other one is when there's multiple offensive line injuries, frankly. It just cripples the team. So when I said 42-10, I'm assuming they get at least 1 guy back. And I think if they get 1 offensive lineman back, you'll probably see Booker slide inside. The Alabama fans are all upset at their right tackle, Formby, from that game. The left guard had like 3 holds himself. I think their problem, and Daniel, I'll let you speak in a minute on this. I thought their problem was interior line play almost as much or more than exterior. The inability to run the ball between the tackles hamstrung that entire offense, and that is going to be the bigger key to Wisconsin. So if they get 1 tackle back, I would be very surprised if he's not playing left tackle, and they would play the guy that was at right tackle again to be able to slide their All-American back to left guard. A year or 2 ago when Texas A&M lost their center and the offensive line went to hell. I mean, this happens all the time. And so that's my assumption. I think if Alabama has the same line that they started with against South Florida, I agree with you. I don't think they cover. I think it is a 2-touchdown swing, 2-touchdown plus, whether or not Alabama actually has 2 of their preferred tackles or not. They have 3 starter caliber guys. If they have 2 of them, I think they win by a sizable margin. If they got 1, they don't. And if that proves true, you can memory hold it. But I'll also say, Daniel, if they go into the Wisconsin game and then they struggle but they don't have that offensive line, I still think a couple weeks from now when they play Georgia, they're probably going to have both those tackles back, and they're probably going to play 2 different tackles in that game against Georgia at this point than they did in the South Florida game. If they come out against Georgia and look like a different team, I will memory hold both these games because I just don't think this offensive line is what they need to be. And what they will be. and so right now it's just a really hard thing to predict because it's kind of more of an injury situation than anything in my.
Yeah, and you also have to think about what that does to your offense. I mean, your defense. Like Alabama at one point in that game had 6 consecutive 3-and-outs. You know, you do that against Wisconsin.
Well, South Florida played 86 plays. They played 17 possessions, 86 plays. It's almost as many as Clemson ran in the infamous 2016 game where the defense got gassed and Clemson came back and won on the 2-point conversion. South Florida played almost as many plays in that game.
What's crazy is South Florida also had a ton of 3-and-outs. Like, that's how good – I don't think people understand how good Alabama's defense played Saturday given what they were up against because they were constantly starting drives at midfield, and they were on the field a lot. I mean, 6 consecutive 3-and-outs is insane to put on your defense. So for all that we're talking about, like if Alabama's offensive line improves, think about what it does to, and you're going to talk me out of my pick the longer this goes, but think about what it does to an offense that in Wisconsin that's not equipped to, come out of a hole. If Alabama's defense is fresh, even though Jefferson's going to be out for the first half, if they're fresh and Alabama's scoring, that does have the potential to get pretty nasty. All right, this one's running long, Josh. You got anything else quickly before we wrap it up?
No, we've probably beat this horse to death, but as I said, it's just an interesting game as much as it can be. Maybe even an opportunity to talk on these two teams, and quite frankly, there are probably a lot of people if they got to this point that watch our channel religiously say, "Why didn't we cover games X, Y, or Z?" There's just not a lot of games out there this week, and I'm looking forward to more college football coming forward.
Yeah, and look, y'all, I do want to give kudos to Alabama and Wisconsin for scheduling this game. And I hope we don't lose these as it becomes all about the playoffs and what your win-loss record is. But for now, we've got a good one to watch. Thanks so much, y'all. Give us your score prediction in the comments. Have a great week, and God bless.